Hi. As I was already introduced, I'm Nomzamo. I'm a mother to 3 children. So my presentation today, I've decided to call it my Paella Birth Story because it had a little bit of everything. Yeah. So my story, I suppose, it starts with a dream. 2 weeks into 2016, last year, I woke up to a dream, a very disturbing dream, peculiar one, by the way. In this dream, I'm with my sister. We're at a house, it's a white house. At the back of the house, there are graves. And it's like we've come to look at one of the graves. It could be a grandmother or something. But then there's one grave, the soil is, like the ground is raised, and there's a coffin, and the coffin is open. Inside the coffin is a child dressed in white. I look at this child, the first time I look at the child, it looks like my daughter, my 9-year-old daughter. I look again, and then it looks like it's my son who's like barely a year old. Not even a year old, he's 3 months old at the time. So I phone my sister who's a Sangoma, and I tell her this dream. So we sit and we analyze it, and then we settle on the interpretation that it must be a baby that I'm being given in the dream. And so that began my story of my 3rd pregnancy. So, similarly with all my other pregnancies, I started with the known route. I went to find myself a gynae. In this time around, I decided that I was not going to use the previous gynae that I'd used, following the disappointment of not having had my VBAC, which we had been discussing during the entire pregnancy, basically. It never happened. Instead, what happened is that I was wheeled into theater on the premise that my baby would potentially face fetal distress. And yes, and then I ended up having another C-section. So this time around, I found a gynae. The experience was not necessarily what I had anticipated. It was a far cry from being pleasant, really, because a lot of times, like a lot of the consultations were very short, very medical, very clinical, very impersonal, you know. And as the months progressed, I realized more and more that I didn't want to continue with her. I didn't want her to deliver my child. And I got to 32 weeks of my pregnancy. And I remember I had an appointment that week, and I couldn't go. And I just decided not to go. It was a no-show. And I didn't have an idea of what I was going to do. I did not have a plan B. In my head, I had these visions of myself delivering the baby myself at home, unassisted. Didn't know how I was going to do that, but that was a vision. And then eventually, a friend came to the rescue. She referred me to a natural midwife. So this was certainly something different for me, you know. It was different. And I suppose it was a turning point in my pregnancy, because up to that point, I felt very isolated and I felt very alone. And for the first time during that particular pregnancy, I felt loved. I felt cared for. It was a healing. I needed it. Looking back, I know that I needed it. It was a healing experience for me. And most importantly, for the first time, I had a voice. You know, my desires mattered. My dreams mattered. And I think what's important as well is the fact that she instilled the faith that my body was more than capable to deliver a child, you know, naturally, that there was nothing faulty about me physically in any way or form. And so we started on the journey of planning for a VBAC for the 2nd time around in my life. We were going to have a home birth, and this particular midwife, one of the things that I had to do basically was to go and register with a hospital for like a backup should anything go wrong, and she only happens to work with public hospitals. So this was yet another area that was unfamiliar to me. So I found myself in a public maternity hospital queuing at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I spent an entire day there being sent from one room to another. Yeah, it wasn't so bad in the end, but yeah, I did that. And then as we got closer to D-Day, the delivery day, I started weighing my options, I started looking at things, and when I weighed all the factors that were at play, I still made the decision that I would go and have the C-section. So on the 24th of September, last year, Heritage Day, I gave birth to a baby girl in a public hospital. So in spite of the fact that for me this was, I feared going, I didn't want to be honest, like you see how the nurses are like with patients, like I expected that I was gonna get foul treatment, the service would be bad altogether, so it was something that I was reluctant to do, but in spite of that, I went, and in spite of that, I did not die on the theater table when I was there. Instead, there were a lot of positives that I took out of that experience. The service from the medical staff, from the nurses all the way up to the doctors, it was very pleasant. They were very friendly. They were very responsive to my needs, whatever it is that I needed. Whenever I called for any assistance, I never got, the response was always positive. The skin-to-skin contact, which was encouraged, it was not encouraged, it was enforced, it was forced, you didn't have a choice. The skin-to-skin contact, I absolutely loved it. I loved the bonding experience with my child. In fact, when I went back home, it's something that I tried to continue as much as possible in the first weeks post-delivery. The breastfeeding training in the hospital was amazing. I've never seen that in the private sector. They would train mothers over and over and over and over again, and there was absolutely no option to feed your child in any other way except via breastfeeding. I didn't even see a milk kitchen in that hospital. If they had it, I don't know, it was hidden to me. The food, although I'd made my own prior arrangements because I expected the food to be bad, but from what I could see, it looked decent enough. So the experience, I was supposed to put up the notes. Yeah, in its entirety, the experience was good. The facilities, they were not that much different from what I would have gotten from the private health facility, But in any event, with any good story in life, there's always going to be the downside, I think with this particular, in as much as I've had 2 prior C-sections, with this particular one, it was the first time that the possibility of death was very much in front of my face that day. I was very much aware of it. After they had injected the spinal, after that, and they put you on the bed, obviously, to get you ready for the procedure. When I lay there, I struggled to breathe. I couldn't breathe, And I remember the anesthetist had to actually come and put a piece of tissue in front of my nose to show that I was breathing, I could breathe. My blood pressure kept dropping. It kept dropping, and every time it dropped, she would inject something in the drip, like this purple solution, and then it would come back up. That happened numerous times. I had this urge to close my eyes consistently, I just want to go into sleep and just doze away, So they kept having to wake me up. The separation anxiety that came between the time of delivering the baby and the time that I was allowed to touch the baby, that was very painful for me. I was an emotional wreck. I cried throughout. The only time I stopped crying was when I saw my baby and I was holding her. That's when it stopped. The post-delivery pains were excruciating, It took about 2 morphine injections for the pain to subside. When I eventually went back home, I suffered from severe backache to such an extent that I used to have these back spasms where on some mornings I would not be able to get up from bed. I would have to take a painkiller in order to be able to move my body. So there was that downside, but in spite of it all, the one thing that I took out of it is the fact that I did give birth to a healthy, bouncing baby girl at 3.3 kilograms, whom I was able to go home with, and I never had any problems with her thereafter. I suppose if I think about the lessons that I took out of this particular experience, the first one is the fact that it instilled my faith in the public health system, you know, and I was able to associate good service with the public health system, because more often than not, we are taught otherwise. Number two, the experience of being under the care of a natural midwife showed me that I could associate the words love and care in the same breath as pregnancy, you know, which is something that's not always there like when you go the gynecological route. And for me, though, the most important out of all of them is the fact that this journey was a very empowering one for me. Every single decision, every single step that I took, it was my decision, it was my choice. I decided. And in spite of the fact that the final product or the final result was not a feedback, all the choices were mine. I owned them, and I owned this journey. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.